Hi, my name is Alark Saxena, and I am the Program Director for Yale Himalaya Initiative. Today we have Frederick with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
Please tell us about yourself.
My name is Frederik van Oudenhoven from the Netherlands. I'm what they would call an ethnobiologist. So my work focuses on this interface between biology and people, how they use it. Been working with agriculture mostly, agricultural biodiversity, in centers around or places around the world where there is important diversity. So mostly Central Asia, in the Stans, the former Soviet countries, and most recently in the Pamir Mountains, which is on the mountain range, on the far west of the Himalayas, really, but on the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan.
Tell us about your work in that region.
Well, I used to work there for a research organization in Rome, the Biodiversity International, the Plant Genetic Resources Institute, because that is a place where important crops come from, were domesticated. Think of the apple. There's many different kinds of apricots, grains, wheat, rye, those kinds of crops. So my initial work there was really to try to get a picture of these crops and the reason that people cultivated them and how they might be safeguarded too, because of course, as elsewhere, modernization and modern agriculture is coming to these regions as well.
What are the as you're saying, modern agriculture is one of the probably creates a challenge for traditional crops. Could you speak a little bit more about some of these challenges?
Yeah. It's interesting because being a center of officially called a center of diversity, even a center of domestication, part of the reason that it is so important is that it's remote. It's very difficult to grow crops there. So the people who live there, they went there initially to escape persecution. So they kind of had to find a way within this very harsh environment to cultivate crops, which is why they're crops with very special characteristics, early ripening, frost resistance, etc. And interestingly, so part of this Pamir region became part of the Soviet Union, which is not really known for its tremendous, for being very considerate towards local agriculture. They had their large sovkhozes and the large collective farms. But because the environment is so difficult, it doesn't not lend itself at all to large-scale cultivation. So the environment there has kind of protected these crop varieties, even during Soviet times. What is a threat now is really foreign agricultural experts coming to the region, not knowing the history of these crops and the people cultivating them, and introducing certified varieties from Switzerland or laboratories in the Netherlands, the US, which then temporarily displace these local varieties, end up being completely unsuitable to the local circumstances. But by the time people realize it, the old crops are gone.
Right.
So that's the main threat.
Could you give an example of any of these things that you see happening in front of you?
Yeah. For the crops, or more broadly, I think it's very much kind of a battle of or not really battle, but a conflict of different ways of thinking about agriculture, and so development experts are there in the firm belief that production has to be improved, and so they get crops from laboratories because those are proven to increase production, and sometimes that is also necessary. But a very specific example I remember is a farmer, a miller, telling me that just when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a lot of famine. That's gonna.
I think we'll have to take a break here. Well, this can actually get edited, which is the great part.
Yeah.
You did say that you should turn off.
Yeah.
Or should I just say?
Pull
Pull the damn thing out.
I'll redo that question too.
Yeah. So I'll start with. Are there specific examples that come to your mind around this challenge?
I mean they're specific to seeds very much. I mean there's a miller who told me about the few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was the time of civil war in Tajikistan. So there was famine. There was a legitimate reason to try to do something to improve the harvests, and so the Foreign Development Organization came in, and as a form of aid, they spread these hybrid, high-yielding varieties. His grandfather warned him not to do it. I mean, you have to know they grow about 153 wheat varieties in the Pamir, so there is a very significant diversity there. So their grandparents told them, don't do this, don't they? But most of his community did then adopt these new varieties. After 3 years, the yield was good, but they realized very soon that the taste wasn't suitable to their dishes. They couldn't do anything with the straw, which they normally use for animal fodder and for building houses, etc. So the variety wasn't used to being laid out on the land to dry, so it would rot. So everything was wrong about it. But they lost their own varieties in the 3 years that they tried it. So they had to cross the river into Afghanistan to recover these old varieties. Luckily, they could.
Okay. Wow.
So that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go back to a question. You said these areas are remote, and I think that's been an important aspect of some of these mountain landscapes and the communities that live in them. The idea of being remote. Could you talk a little bit more about how do you what is remoteness in these landscapes? How do you understand it?
Yeah. Well, I think the correct academic term would be to call it relative isolation. That's how people refer to the Pamir. So it is definitely an area in which, in order to get to some communities, you have to walk 12 days to get to a village from anything that looks like a road. So that's isolation, and there are real challenges associated with that. On the other hand, it has always also been a minor road of the Silk Road. So there has always been an influence from China on one hand, and then Europe or the Caucasus on the other side. And you see this in many ways in the crops they grow. They have the mulberries, the apricots. They come from China. But then there's religious practices that may come from India, and it's a bit of an amalgamation. In that sense, it's not that isolated, but it was isolated enough to avoid the Genghis Khan, so that they were never affected by those large-scale raids. And
Fascinating. You've been working on this book project, and let me pull this out. This book project. Tell us a little bit about this book.
I'm not very good at telling a little bit about it, otherwise it wouldn't have become so fat. But
yeah. I'll pass it on to you.
Sure. Well, yeah. Well, I told you the work I was doing so this is a book about the food culture in the Pamir region, and having worked there as a researcher, as a scientist on crops, at some point I started to doubt my capacity, or the capacity of science, if you will, to safeguard some of these old varieties, the practices that are associated with these varieties, and the larger culture that is really very much based on agriculture. So just saving seeds for the sake of saving seeds doesn't make any sense to farmers. It took me a while to realize that. what made much more sense was to look at the food. Because if you, well, and this is literally what happens, people stop making the food in which these local varieties of grains and fruits are used. So that goes on a few more years and you lose the reason to cultivate certain crops. So we started to ask, grandmothers, farmers, teachers, children about their traditional foods. Not knowing that, certainly not at the beginning, we just thought we'd make a little recipe book, 30 pages recipe book. We'd given each other, Jamila, who's the co-author of this book, and we'd given ourselves 3 months to write it, and that would be it. And the interesting thing that happened is that you start talking about food, and people would tell us everything. They would start to talk about their history, the way they survived the wars, the way they celebrate New Year, the way they treat sick people. It's all part of this. Food seems to be a very very central element to life, and it's something we kind of discovered while asking, which is why here we are 700 pages later, and
yeah.
Yeah.
So, what are the themes that you've covered through this, in this book?
Well, one of the things we realized while documenting some of the foods and where they came from, their histories, is that you can pretty much look at describe the history and the culture and the identity of Pamiri people through their food. So we begin with the idea of domestication. How have people reached this landscape, which is so barren and so hard impossible to live in almost? How have they made it their own? How have they domesticated that place? And this is where the title of our book comes from, With Our Own Hands. People would repeatedly tell us, you see these fields, you see these crops, you see the utensils we have. We made that with our own hands. So there's a sense of pride in that. And then there's the topic of trade. Right. So there was the Silk Road, which came a little later than the first domestication of crops,
right.
Which brought other influences, religions, foods.
Right.
And then you start talking about trade, and people start to compare it to the trade that's happening now. The big plastic boxes coming from China, and how those values are changing, and how it challenges who they are when they all of a sudden have to ask money for things that to them are very hard to express in monetary value.
Right.
Health is another one. So traditional medicine, which is another thing that's very quickly being replaced and lost.
Right.
And a few more.
Yeah. And so, as I see, there are at least 3 different scripts that this book has been is showcasing.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, our main aim in writing this book from the very beginning, it's kind of funny. It started with a grandmother telling us about some of her recipes, and as she was talking, her family started to sit around us, and then more people, and then after an hour, half the community was there in that room. Was jam-packed, and she grabbed my arm. She said, "Hey, you see how important this is? People want to know, but people have forgotten. So please write this down. Please bring it back to me. I'll pay you for it, and I'll pay for a copy of your book." And I said yes, not knowing what it would entail, right? But that then stayed for us. It remained the main idea, to be able to document some of this knowledge, which it's an oral culture, so there is no written, their languages are not written, so none of this knowledge is documented, and as soon as grandma dies, the knowledge is gone. So that was the idea, but then how do you make it accessible to people who speak 5 different languages in a very small area, and people living on. So you have to imagine the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. They speak the same general language, Persian, but on the Tajiks they write Persian in the Cyrillic script. So this one. because of the legacy of the Soviet Union. On the south, in the south in Afghanistan, they used the Arabic Persian Arabic script. So there you go. You needed 3 languages to make it, and 3 scripts to make it accessible to all people in that region, and to a wider audience. And that was the main thought behind it. Yeah.
It's very interesting, and especially the landscape that you're working in. It's been, as you said, it's relatively remote, but it has, in some ways, has also been influenced by the Silk Road and the movement of religion across these landscapes. And bringing this conversation to today's context, you were saying that communities are now facing these material coming from outside, especially China. Could you speak a little bit more about the market and the conditions that are now? Now these people are getting influenced by.
Yeah, I mean the final chapter of the book. So we called the book With Our Own Hands, and then the final chapter we called it With Whose Hands, because people would often kind of complain, saying, we were always in charge of who we were, of what we did, of our agriculture, our farms, our homes. But especially in Tajikistan, which is much more influenced by these international trade routes. In Afghanistan, things have remained much more as they have been for hundreds of years. But people feel they're losing control over their future, over their lives, because of the huge influence of these products and ideas about what does it mean to, what does progress mean, what does development mean. And so it's hard, because life isn't easy in these mountains. You have to work very hard to churn your butter. You have to go to the pastures. It's a tough life, and it's easy to romanticize because it's also very beautiful. But people feel very double about it, very, very ambivalent. On one hand, they do feel it's important to maintain these traditions of farming and making your own flour, your own bread, your own butter, everything. On the other hand, they can go to the bazaar and buy the same products for much less money. So the real problem then is that those products coming to the bazaar are, of course, of very inferior quality. So they get wheat flour from Canada, they get oil from Iran and China, rice from China. And their lifestyle changes. They don't have to work in the land anymore. So you replace food that is really very localized, that is very much adapted to local climate and conditions, with imported food. It becomes a more sedentary lifestyle. And so there was a doctor we spoke with who said that during the Soviet Union, he had only had 2 patients with diabetes. And now 1 in 2 people in the region has some kind of sugar-related or disease. So that's a change and a challenge.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see that often we consider this mode of development, and you said the definition of development is changing, right? And then it's often considered that more goods and services reaching to larger group of people should be a better thing, right? Many governments are actively engaged in providing for that last mile. But as you're saying, there are unintended consequences of these. Did you see how are people responding to such change? Do you see people making, is a change in lifestyle, change in behavior in response to these unintended consequences?
Let me think. I need to think about that, because there's many aspects, I think, to that question. something that I've pained my mind, that I had such difficulty understanding, is that a lot of things are introduced into the Pamirs, and people complain about them, but they're also very lax about it. They think, well, it's here, so we're going to use it, and they're also lax about the consequences it has, the loss of crop varieties, the loss of traditions, the loss of part of their identity, and it's hard to figure out how that dynamic, but I think one of the things that happens is that the things that come in, so I'm talking about really about ideas of progress, so ideas, but also of products and seeds, and values about the economy. They come in with such a power. They're introduced by development organizations. They're introduced by intellectuals that have been raised and bred in the West. They're introduced from laboratories in the West. So there's a lot of power behind these ideas, and people there, they feel that they are very simple, and why would we contradict people, who obviously have the best intentions, because they do. Like, we're just going to accept what's coming at us, and that for us also became one of the reasons for writing this book, is that people in one valley wouldn't know necessarily what's happening in the next valley. So there's not really like a unified idea of what Pamiri identity is, where they could point to us, like, go have a look here. This is what we have. This is who we are, and please try to learn about us before you introduce these new things. And that's what we try to do with this book, is bundle as many voices, local voices, as we could, and be a mirror, essentially, that they could then, when the next well-paid consultant comes, you say, okay, read this first, and then you come back and we talk.
700 pages later.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is fascinating. I'm curious. This is, some of the things that you're mentioning, I can see similarities in other parts of Himalayas as well. Talking about going to a little bit more on the loss of certain crops, but the introduction of new crops, and then challenge there. But also thinking about how mobility in these landscapes is coming in or not, right? So could you speak a little bit more about how, if agriculture systems are getting affected, what kind of livelihoods are people now moving towards, if that is the case, and what are the trends there and the impact of those trends
as a result of increased mobility,
or loss of agricultural crops and so on?
Yeah. Wait. So maybe I'm not sure I understand correctly. So if you have the so there's one thing, mobility and the consequence of that, but then
sometimes what I'm thinking is, often mobility can be seen both as a cause but also as an effect. Right. So loss of agriculture could increase mobility for people trying to search for newer opportunities.
Sure. I think because of how people explained their use of the landscape to us, I kind of start to see the whole Pamir region from the lower valleys to the higher plateaus. It's almost as being one farm. So people, like in many parts of the Himalayas, they would use in the summer, part of the community goes to the summer pastures where they can pasture their animals, and the people in the lower would stay in lower parts to cultivate their crops. And there's a very lively barter trade between communities who may do more of one or more of the other. So those movements of people kind of integrate the landscape. All parts of the landscape are used, are used in Afghanistan, were used in Tajikistan very much. There's a fairly strong distinction. So what you see as people move away from agriculture, because young people don't see it as such a worthwhile pursuit anymore, because they feel they cannot make the money with it that is needed to then pay for other services that do now cost money, is that less land in Tajikistan is under cultivation. The pastures are not maintained anymore, and kind of as a consequence, people say, well, see, the Pamirs, there's not enough land in the Pamirs to sustain the population, which is true to some extent, but it's also because less land is under cultivation now than there was 50 years ago. So that's certainly one thing that's happening. Another thing is labor migration, which is extremely it's a very big driver of change. As in some communities, 60-70% of young people have left their communities to go to Moscow, to go to Pakistan, to go to Iran. And well, you can imagine what happens with communities where the working force is basically gone. It's grandparents tilling the field and kids being raised by their grandparents. So it has profound influences on community life.
Right.
Yeah.
What kind of are there particular trades in which people get engaged when they're migrating to other countries, or?
It's usually low-paid manual labor. So a very large number of Tajik Pamirs are in Russian cities in Moscow. They're treated like dogs. There's very strong racism. They paint, they cook, they do construction work. Some make it, manage to do a little better. And many return also thinking, wondering or realizing that they need the mountains.
Right.
That is who they are. And others they're quite happy selling chocolate bars in any kiosk and being able to send money to their parents. It's hard to, it's not one.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's pretty, and it's pretty hard, especially when, and we're seeing this as a trend across Himalayas of people leaving for, Nepali young men can be seen across the entire world in some ways, from Middle East to Southeast Asia, all of those places. And it's hard because they're doing all sorts of whatever possibly they can work with. I'm curious now of one more thing that's been discussed is, do you see urbanization happening in relatively rural landscapes? And do you see the impacts of urbanization also within these landscapes?
Yes. Again, much more in the Tajik Pamirs than in the Afghan Pamirs. So because young people return with money and with new ideas about having your own house, which is not something that used to be the case. They build new houses on family land. There's also money on that side, on the Tajik side of the border, through drug trafficking. It remains the main route for opium and heroin from Afghanistan to Russia and Europe. So you see big houses and big aluminum roofs and consequently a stark decrease in agricultural land used for agricultural purposes. In the past, agricultural land was considered to be so precious that you would only build your house on big rocks or in places that were absolutely unsuitable for agriculture. So that mentality is completely gone in the young generation.
Right.
Old people, they shake their head and think, what's happening? But yeah.
In terms of trends, we talk about climate change and as kind of a driver for many of these species loss, but also in changing in agriculture systems. What influence do you see in these landscapes?
Well, at the moment, for some people find it quite positive because the struggle in the Pamirs is always, how do I get my crops to ripen with a short growing season and extremely cold winters? So the prized varieties of wheat are the varieties that ripen in a very short period of time, and so now farmers manage to have their apricots and their fruit, the other fruits, ripen at much higher elevations, way above 9,000 feet. So there's that, but there's also flash flooding, and the realization among more and more farmers now. You see, for them, water is, of course, is something extremely important. It's very, very sacred. They look up the mountain and they see the glaciers and the deposits of snow every winter, and they know that their agriculture and their life depends on it. But there have been quite a few winters now without snow, so there's still water in the rivers from the glaciers, but they retreat very fast, like in many other places. And you have other consequences too. Winter wheat, winter barley. They need a layer of snow to be protected against the wind, against freezing. So most winter varieties are being lost. People have stopped cultivating them. They don't see the sense anymore. So they're.
But you were saying that you could get your apricots and some other crops at higher elevation. Are people moving up also, trying to find agricultural land in the higher altitudes?
Not as much as you'd expect. I mean, they have always tried to even at the summer pastures, which are, well over. They get to 9,000-10,000 feet. The Kyrgyz tribes who also live in the Pamirs, they live much higher still. My feet and meter conversion is
You
sometimes a bit
meters.
rusty.
You can use meters.
So at 4,200 meters elevation, so quite high.
Yeah, 4,200 is 12,000 plus.
Yeah, so not generally a place where you'd cultivate anything.
Yeah.
And still there it's hard, but they've traditionally tried to grow barley, especially at the summer pastures. But because again the land isn't occupied as much as it used to be, the infrastructure, the water canals are dilapidated. So it's more that people adopt other crops.
Right.
They're able now to grow fruit crops where before they couldn't. And and this is a nice or good influence of some of the development projects that are happening. People use greenhouses. They grow a lot more vegetables than they used to be able to. They use the thermal heat from the hot springs to grow crops.
Interesting. Yeah. So actually that brings me to the next question, which is, and this is very interesting. People do find newer ways of growing crops. One of the idea of this remoteness, right, is also sometimes reduced influence of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and hence the use of them, which has been kind of now been seen as an opportunity to sell, organic food, organic crops. Has there been a trend of that kind in that region?
Well, it's definitely, of course, during Soviet times in Tajikistan, people just put a bag with fertilizers and pesticides at the point where the water entered the field and just let it flow. Not at all aware of the consequences. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, people have simply not been able to afford, especially fertilizers. And most of the local crops, they grow fine without fertilizer. They're used to, they're adapted to the environment. The problem is because many development projects focus on livelihoods, on income opportunities, and most of the people being farmers, selling agricultural crops is a big topic. The problem is that there's not a whole lot of surplus. The land is very, very, very limited. So producing enough organic food to feed other parts of the country is people have tried, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think there are opportunities. I'm not a huge connoisseur of markets, but the mulberries, for example, there's a large variety of mulberries, about 60 white mulberry varieties. And in the West, of course, they're a hype. It's superfood.
Right, right.
But also there, you see, it's hard because people vote for them. This is the tree that came to them from paradise. This is the tree that is in most places more important than wheat, than grains. That's their staple food. So in times of hunger and war, they would depend for up to 70% of their food on mulberries alone.
Wow.
So it's very difficult then to... I once accompanied a few women who grow mulberry to the Terra Madre conference in Italy, which is a slow food thing.
Right.
With their mulberries, and they were amazed that people would pay €3 for a kilo of mulberries. I think now they're €3 for 100 grams or something. And they came back with a bag of money. But since then, the idea for them, what is a mulberry, has changed, and what are the values that we associate with our mulberry production.
Right.
So it's quite, it has quite a disruptive influence on agriculture.
And commoditization of these is, of course, makes it very difficult. And of course, this is very complex, where at the same time you want to...
It's necessary.
It's necessary too.
Yeah.
So it's kind of back and forth.
Yeah.
In terms of some of the future trends that you see, especially with the idea of food and food crops, what are some general things that you're seeing people have to deal with in the coming time?
I find it very hard to predict the future.
Sure.
I guess in general. I can tell you what I hope for the future, and as I told you, there's a strong influence of ideas and crops coming from outside of the Pamirs, and what we've tried to do with this book is kind of level the playing field. It's like, okay, well, if these ideas come from outside, and some of them are worthwhile, others are not. These are ideas and crops that we have and that we've had for a long time. Some of them will have to change, some of them may stay. But that at least there is that the discussion is among equals, that there is equal information available about local traditional things, and that the ideas coming from the outside will have to be more convincing than they have been before they displace or merge with local things. So my hope is that you get kind of a fusion of these two. But it may be idle hope.
Yeah.
Really.
And so this actually, I was kind of moving in the same direction, calling it the solutions to sustainability, or solutions for sustainability. What would be a few things that you would think would be helpful for, this work is, for example, is a great, as you're saying, equalizer for not just simply adopting whatever comes from outside as, the silver bullet, but actually making sure that do we really need it or not. So are there other solutions to sustainability, if I may put it that way, that you can think of for that landscape?
Well, I mean, one thing that people really refer back to is the industries that were there during the Soviet Union. But of course, during the Soviet Union, everything was subsidized. So there were factories in the Pamirs, meat processing, fruit processing, etc., etc. But in a free market economy, they would not be able to sustain themselves. So it's always something that people feel should be built up again. Industry, some large employment. There's barely any employment. I personally find it hard to see how that could happen, though I'm sure it might. And it's very interesting to see the different images that different people have about the future. Jamila, for her PhD research, she had communities draw an image of how they saw the landscape in the future, and she had people from development agencies draw the same thing. And here you see an international airport, you see people kite surfing on the lakes in the Pamirs, you see helicopters, you see big factories, you see express bus lines. I mean, the whole shebang. I don't think that's the solution. I'm sure it's probably going to go in that direction. God forbid. then the community's images they're quite diverse, but they all there's food in every picture. There are small scale agricultural fields in every picture. There's religion. There's the sacred places that people go to. So there's a lot to do with identity and their farming past. I won't say that the solution is go back to farming, but I will say that farming should remain a very important part of the future solutions, mostly because it's really who these people are. It is much of their identity.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all this wonderful work, and
Thank you.
wish you good luck.
Thanks.